On today's episode of Locked On Wild, an audit of the Minnesota Wild's books.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We thank you, as always, for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we're peeling back the books and taking a look at the Minnesota Wild's financial situation. We'll take a look at just how much money is available next year and beyond. And we will take a look at how trade protections have factored into various extensions recently. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and I got super curious about this last night. And so went through and charted the trade protections for every single team in the NHL. No trades, modified no trades, no moves. I charted it all. We'll talk about that at the end of the show today, but there's been a lot of discussion as to the salary cap situation for the Minnesota Wild next year and beyond. And so let's just peel the books back and see for ourselves the situation in which the Minnesota Wild are in. Now, as with a lot of things that I do for this show, I like to come up with the idea, but then solve it in real time so that my opinions are not necessarily swayed before recording and that I can just present the information and then react to that after the fact. So I have not looked at the Wild's books before right now. I wanted to look into this, but what we're going to do is we're basically just going to calculate out with extensions factored in, with players on the roster. We're going to calculate out where the Minnesota Wild are at for 2025, 2026, because that's the magic number. That is the year in which we finally go to strictly buyouts for Zach Parise and Ryan Suter, $833K apiece. And so you go from $14.6 million to $1.6. So you're sitting at a surplus of $13 million, right? Well, let's find out for ourselves. So Cap Friendly, big shout out to him. Wanted to also get this in before Cap Friendly turns into property of the Washington Capitals, because that day is coming soon. So as of right now, the Minnesota Wild have $62.786 million in salary cap tied into their roster, which stands at 13 players and 25 standard player contracts on the books, which leaves, and this Cap Friendly also factors in an increase in the salary cap to $92 million. So a $4 million bump in the salary cap. As of right now, with those 13 players, the Minnesota Wild have a salary cap space of $27.546 million. So $27.5 million in cap space for next season. But we got to subtract a few things from that number to see where we are really at. We're going to get an extension for Brock Faber. Faber on his ELC. He's making $900K right now. So there's been a lot of discussion as to where Faber's extension is going to end up. It seemed like it was going to be on the high side early on. Now there's been some reporting that maybe it comes in a little bit more of a hometown discount. So whether it be 9, whether it be 7, I'm going to split the difference for the sake of this exercise. For the sake of this exercise, I'm going to split the difference. We'll say that Brock Faber gets $8 million annually. That would be an increase over his current salary of right around $7 million. So let's take $7 million out of that 27.5. That gets us to 20.5. Now, this figure factors in Jake Middleton's extension. It factors Yakov Trenin into the mix. So we don't have to add those figures. Those are already accounted for. But there are some other players that will be adding to it as well. Marco Rossi, a restricted free agent after this season. If he's still here, he will likely be getting an extension as well. For the ease of the math, for the ease of just going through this, I'm going to say $4 million a year. Could it be higher than that? Yes. Could it be lower than that? Sure. Even numbers, just to try to see where this goes. So we're going to say $4 million for Rossi. So 20.5 minus 4, you're now down to $16.5 million available with 15 players on the roster. Murat Huznadinov, currently on his ELC. And actually, let me add $1 million to it, because Rossi on his ELC, $4 million is a $3 million raise, basically, over what he's getting right now. So that's $3 million added on to that. So $17.5 million with 15 players accounted for the Minnesota Wild. Murat Huznadinov, currently on his ELC, and he will be another player up for a potential extension. Let's say with Huznadinov, because we saw him get some time last year at the NHL level, would hope to see similar production, maybe a bit of a step up this year. I'm going to say, just for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to say that he gets a bridge deal, and I'm going to say $2 million a year. A 3-year deal for $2 million per. So let's subtract $2 million from that figure. We're at 15.5, and you've got 16 players on the roster. And again, this is why I didn't go into math, because it's not easy. So you're at $16.5 million, because Huznadinov adds an additional $1 million over what he's currently making. So $16.5 million, you've got 16 players on the roster. Jesper Wallstedt, up for an ELC, or up for a new contract after his ELC is done this season. Marc-Andre Fleury will not be on the books, and so he will be up. And so what he gets for an ELC, I'm going to say, because the assumption will be that he'll be the main goalie at that point, I'm going to say $3 million here. So that's an additional $2 million off of the books. That gets you to 14.5. And you have now 17 players on the roster. And so looking at who else, John Merrill is an unrestricted free agent. Adios. See ya. So that is not a contract that has to get factored in. We already factored in Brock Faber, Declan Chisholm. I'm going to say, for the sake of this exercise too, I'm going to say that he gets this year a 2-year deal, and I think it'll be at about, I'm going to say $1 million per year. 2-year, $2 million deal. So that is another $1 million off the books. So now we're at 13.5 with 18 players on the roster. Now, if Zeev Boyum signs his ELC and he goes on the roster, that's another $1 million. That's 12.5, but now you're at 19 players on the roster. And so you look at, and Jacob Loco, he is an arbitration eligible restricted free agent. for 2025, 2026. So he could be a guy that the Wilds keep around, but honestly, just looking at kind of where this whole situation is at, my guess is that he probably gets. I don't know. Like, it's just another player that you add into that mix of guys that are suited for bottom six. It's a lot of roster spots that have been tied up to guys that are bottom six players. So let's just say he sticks around for another year. Let's call that a mill. And so that's going to be about $500K in additional money on top of what he's making already. So you are at, with 20 players on the roster, you are at $12 million available. And so this is rough math. This is just extreme rough draft of seeing if, and this is assuming that none of the players that are currently on the roster get moved, because guess what? If you move some of those guys off the roster, that frees up additional money. If you were to get Freddie Gaudreau off the books, that's an additional 2.1. If you were to move a Marcus Foligno, that's an additional 4 off the books. And so, yes, there is money available, but you have to, I think, you got to do some house cleaning on this roster to really free up spots to be able to add pieces into this mix. And this is accounting for Liam Ogren being on the roster. Let's account for Danila Yurov taking one of those roster spots. And that is on an ELC. That's an additional $1 million off of what you currently have. So now you're down to 11 with 21 spots on the roster accounted for. And so as we do just this quick little exercise, it's not as much a money issue per se. It's a roster spot issue, because you've got a lot of spots filled, and you basically have filled your entire forward lineup already, with the exception of maybe having a spot for one guy to be able to hop in. Or are you going to take a majority of that money that you have available? Are you going to throw that at somebody to massively impact your top six, to where you slide Matt Zuccarello down to like a third line role for his final year on the team? And so this is super rough, super quick math, just to try to get an idea as to what is left. And now, if some of these contracts come in higher than the figure that I have factored in, that's less money available. If you get some savings on those deals, sure, that's more money available. But folks, it's a roster spot issue. I think that is more of a problem at this point. And I'll tell you why that is probably the bigger issue, because as we go with our next topic, there's a lot of trade protections that have been thrown to particular players on this team. And so we'll take a look at just where the Minnesota Wild stack up amongst the rest of the league in terms of no moves and no trades. That's on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Summer is here, ladies and gentlemen, which means that you can spend your afternoons taking in America's pastime. Headed to Target Field to watch the Minnesota Twins take on some of their Central Division opponents. And with everything going on with Diamond Sports, this is about your best bet to be able to see a game here this season. Thankfully, Target Field is an absolute gem. And if you, like me, like to just kind of walk around and take in the ballpark, Game Time can help get you in the gate and make your Major League Baseball experience super enjoyable. Listen to some of these perks that Game Time offers for their services. They offer you zone deals where you can choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats. You can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. And did you know that you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more? Game Time also offers their lowest price guarantee. If you find tickets that are cheaper, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to tune in here throughout the rest of the week. We've got episodes lined up for you tomorrow for your 4th of July, as well as on Friday, when we will talk about the top 10 prospects in the Minnesota Wild system with Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod. We will also take and create an episode of our discussion with Jack Carlson from Sunday's live show. If you missed that, I encourage you to tune in to the entirety of it. 60 minutes of absolute elite stories from Jack. But we'll take some of the highlights for you and give you an additional episode as you're headed up to the cabin for the weekend for the 4th of July festivities. And then we're back at it on Monday. Alex and I will discuss some of the big news here from this week. And we'll also have our Monday night live episode for you. Denny and What the Bleep Are You Smoking? We'll be talking about some of what we've seen here since free agency started. Alex will be joining us for that as well. So full day to get you back off the 4th of July holiday coming up on Monday here on Locked On Wild. So let's get back to this, because technically there is money available, but as I just laid out, roster spots are at a premium. And this is where the ability to move players off the roster would be particularly handy. But according to my calculations, the Minnesota Wild are tied for second in the NHL in trade protections handed out with their contracts. The Minnesota Wild have handed out 11 total, 1 no trade, 3 no modified no trades, and 7 no move clauses. 7 no moves, that leads the entire NHL. That is most in the NHL amongst all franchises. Who has the most modified no trades? That is Seattle. They've got 9 of them. And so the only teams that are in double digits, Seattle, Vegas, Colorado, Minnesota, and the team that is leading the bunch is the New York Islanders. They've got 12 of them. Pittsburgh also has 10. Boston has 10. The team that has the least, Nashville, with 2. So why is this? Why is it that there are so many that are handed out by the Minnesota Wild? Well, a good example, like let's compare, for instance, the let's just compare Nashville to where Minnesota's at right now. Well, Nashville they're all in. They're going for it. And so it's not as much of a, like, you don't have to coax players as much to try to get them to sign, because you are very clearly going for it. And so players want to go there to be part of that and have less of an issue. They have less of an issue if things don't go well, because the way that they're structured, their window is probably this year and next year for sure. So you got 2 good cracks at it to try to go win the Stanley Cup. Some of the other teams that are good as well, the New York Rangers kind of surprised me having 9. Philadelphia, much younger team, they have just 3. Buffalo has 3, again, a much younger team. Florida Panthers have 6, but those are all tied into the guys you'd expect. Those are all tied into the top 6 guys. And so those are guys that you're looking to build around long term. I guess my point here is that this, at least from Minnesota perspective, because of where the Wild are at right now, this is the price of doing business. Now, could you argue that a no move is excessive compared to a modified no trade? Sure. Is a no trade clause excessive compared to a modified no trade? Absolutely. But this again is the issue. Kirill Kaprizov having a no move clause, that's not a problem. You should for a player of that caliber. Joel Eriksson Ek having a modified no trade clause, that doesn't bother me because he is a player that you are looking to build around long term. Matt Boldy as well. He doesn't have any trade protection. You could argue maybe he should, but again, these are the guys that you should be building around. And it's not to say that you can't do anything with these because, for the next couple of seasons, Marcus Foligno has a no move. Then in years 3 and 4, it's a modified no trade. Ryan Hartman, it is the same thing. 15-team no trade in 25-26, 10-team no trade in 26-27. Freddie Gaudreau is a 15-team no trade. Marcus Johansson is a full no trade. Here's another thing that is a little bit concerning for me is while it's not impossible to trade these guys, there are two issues that pop into my head for this cap situation. Number one is you have to get to a point in which Bill Guerin wants to actually move these guys. That's the first issue. That's the first problem because this is Bill Guerin's roster. This is the team that Bill Guerin has put together. These are the players that he sought out. These are the players that he views as the core. These are the players that he views as the ones that he wants to win with. And so it's not going to be easy for Bill Guerin to these inner core players in his mind to move them. And with especially before these modified no trades kick in, you could be fully ready to move a guy. But if that player does not okay it, then you got additional problems. And that's where the messiness starts to come in. That's where the messy separations start to come in. And that's the kind of stuff that leaves impact on your cap beyond simply moving those players off the roster. And I'll talk about what I mean with that to finish the show today as we peel back the books, take a look at where the Minnesota Wild are really at for 2025, 2026, and beyond. We'll finish that discussion after this. One final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. So let's talk about this. Let's say you would get to a point next year. Let's say you get to a point where some playoff team comes calling and says, hey, we would really like to add a player of Marcus Foligno's caliber to our roster for a playoff push. But here's the rub. Here's the sticking point. I'm just going to use the Florida Panthers as an example because, well, they just won the Cup. Florida Panthers come knocking and they say, hey, we want Marcus Foligno. You guys are not in position. You're out of it at the trade deadline. You're not in a position to be going for it. We want Marcus Foligno. Number one, if you can get past that hurdle of Bill Guerin saying not for sale. If he were to say, yeah, let's talk about this, Florida counters with, our books are pretty tight. We're going to need you to retain some of that salary. We're going to need you to retain 50% of that so that we can get him on the books. And then all of a sudden, that's hanging on your books for the next couple of seasons. And yeah, $2 million, who cares? It's not a ton. But if you would have structured that contract differently, you wouldn't be looking at any of that, having to retain any of that. Same thing for Ryan Hartman. Maybe the Tampa Bay Lightning say, hey, we need a little oomph in the bottom of our lineup. What will you give us for Hartman? But hey, you got to retain. You got to retain half of this. Again, if you would have structured that a little differently, maybe not added as much trade protection, it's a contract it's a conversation that wouldn't have to be had. And the one that's, and again, it's a low dollar amount, but the one that I kind of am concerned most about is Freddie Gaudreau. Yes, he was hurt last year. His production was just not there really at any point. Let's say he has a bounce back season this year. Okay, maybe then you can factor him in to a crowded bottom six. But if he doesn't, then you are looking at having to buy a guy out when that contract was based off of a hypothetical to begin with. That contract was given out because Dean Evson used him in a ton of situations that he probably just was in over his head with. And now you get another coach here, and he's like, no, I don't need a face-off specialist. I'm just going to use Joel Eriksson-Ek whenever I need to win a face-off. Or I've got 4 or 5 other guys higher up on the list. If I need to win a face-off, I'm going to go use one of those guys. Like, it just, if you were worried about Marco Rossi not taking off, you can give Freddie you can give him a middle of the road extension after the season. But all of these at face value, that's the price of doing business. That's the price of adding a guy into your lineup. Case by case basis. That is the price of getting a guy to come to Minnesota compared to a team that is, on the legitimate track to win a cup. Because everybody knows about the cap constraints. Every single person knows that Minnesota is dealing with that over these next couple of years. And so everybody says going in, it's not a team that is really suited to win right now. And so then to get players to come here, you got to overpay. You got to overpay. You got to promise to keep them around. I'll come here, but I don't want to be traded in a year if things go south. I don't want you to do what the Arizona Coyotes or the San Jose Sharks do. I don't want you to just turn around and trade me after I get set. But here's the problem. A lot of good general managers make tough decisions. A lot of good general managers have to make tough decisions every single year. Vegas Golden Knights, they may be one of the most active teams at turning their roster around. And that leads to tough decisions. That leads to not being able to pay Jonathan Marchessault and him going to the Nashville Predators. That leads to having a bunch of guys that come in for a cup run and then don't end up hanging around after it. But that's the price of doing business. And so these things can all be true. Yes, there is, based on my rough calculations, yes, there is some money available next year. Yes, there are a lot of players that are currently on the roster. And so if you add somebody to the mix or you want to call up some of these prospects to see where they're at, you're going to have to make moves to get them off the roster. And it's not as simple in a lot of these cases. It's not as simple as telling one of those guys, hey, we're sending you elsewhere. Thanks for all you've given us over the last couple of seasons. Best of luck to you in the future. It's not that simple because the trade protections in a lot of situations allow the player the opportunity to say, no, I'm not going. And there are ways around that too. The New York Rangers, they had a situation in which they were looking to move a guy, put him on waivers and traded him. So there are ways around it, but a lot of them involve further messing up the books. And so a clean cap is hard to attain, and it just, I want to end with this because I think this is something that a lot of us will vehemently agree with. And this was an assessment from The Athletic on the Minnesota Wild's free agency, or from Bleacher Report, excuse me. Sarah Sivan, I just don't understand how Minnesota Wild fans keep it together. This team feels like a social experiment conducted by psychologists to slowly but surely chip away at any semblance of reality and sanity one has, until you're staring at a team made up of 23 of the most indistinguishable hockey players who have ever been assembled. So, cap situation, trade protections, but a lot of these guys are kind of in the same group. That's the other thing about this. A lot of the players are in kind of the same group as to what they do. And because of that, you bring in a guy in Yakov Trenin who could be quality. He could actually provide you areas in which you need help. But based off of the contract that was given, which again, to get him to come to Minnesota, you got to overpay. You got to add in some other things. But now you've got this group of guys, Freddie Gaudreau, Yakov Trenin, Ryan Hartman, Marcus Foligno, Matt Zuccarello, Jake Middleton, all these guys that have been retained. They're kind of the same class of player. They say your roster resembles your GM as they start to construct it. You'd have thought when Bill Guerin was constructing the roster that there would be more goal scorers on it. But I don't know. It's getting harder and harder to just not say I see all the frustration and I get it. Like I get the frustration that people have with where this team is at and where they're going. Because you have such a bright prospect pool. You've got guys that can make massive impacts, as we talked about earlier this week. But every one of these, it just seems like pushes that further down the road. And if now, from a cap perspective, if you're looking now at 2026, 2027, having, according to Cap Friendly, $46 million in cap space, I'll tell you one of the guys who does not factor into that right now, Kirill Kaprizov. So we'll be talking about this all summer, but just something to think about as we move forward here, and as we get you into your 4th of July long week and weekend. So thank you for tuning into today's episode. Hit the like button if you have not already on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new episodes. Also, make sure to subscribe on your favorite audio platforms, whether it be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you tune in. We are certainly happy to have you, and we appreciate all the support. And we will continue to bring you the episodes here throughout the rest of the week. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.